Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, and I'm super excited to be here with Sam Marquis, who's going to be talking about his book, Captain Kidd, A True Story of Treasure and Betrayal. And I am a history, total nerd, so I cannot wait to hear what we have to hear, what Sam has to say, including the fact that he is the ninth generation. No, what is it?
Ninth great grandson, which is it is nine generations basically. Yeah.
Yes, ninth great grandson of Captain Kidd. So he might know of what he speaks. Who knows? Maybe he had letters in his attic or something. So we'll find all that stuff out in a second. I just want to say thanks to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. We couldn't do this fun stuff without them. I'd like to thank Sam for letting us share this program with other libraries because, of course, you know me, when libraries work together, we make magic. And you can buy signed books by Sam from Aesop's Fable, our very favorite indie bookstore. He does have slides, as you can see, so we're going to turn the chat off during his slides, and then I'll open it again when his slides are done so that you're not distracted by them. Like I said, Sam is the ninth great grandson of Captain Kidd. He is by day, and what is it, like a something geologist? I was like, what is that?
It's a hydrogeologist, which means I'm a groundwater expert for groundwater cleanup and groundwater modeling and expert witness work for contamination in groundwater, basically.
Oh, well, that seems very different from being, as your bio says, like the best historian out there.
Well, I don't know who said that, but maybe there's hyperbole is everywhere these days. So
I enjoyed reading that. I was like, hey, you know what? You got it, flaunt it. So, Sam, welcome to our virtual stage. Thank you so much for doing this.
thanks for
And
having me, Mina. So I appreciate being here. You want me to just take it from here?
yeah, I was going to say, tell us about yourself, and then we're going to
Oh,
start the slides, and I will be off screen, and I'll come back when you're done.
sounds good. So I'm going to give talk today about my new book, Captain Kidd, A True Story of Treasure and Betrayal, that came out in mid-May, and kind of tell a little bit about my background and you know about Captain Kidd because that's what we're going to be interested. I've given this talk at a number of bookstores and book events and book signings and things, so it's a little bit tailored for people who haven't read the book and I don't want to spoil things. So there are so I try to have kind of not spoiler alerts, but try and get the general picture of Captain Kidd without getting in too much detail on the factual items. This group's probably going to be a mix of people, so I'm going to kind of go through it, and then obviously your questions will probably, for those who are kind of Captain Kidd aficionados, they'll already know the story. So we will be giving away some things for those who want a spoiler alert up front. So the question is, my presentation has kind of a general format here. I'm going to talk about, why I chose to write a book about Captain Kidd. It was my 12th book, so why did I wait so long to do that? People seem to be kind of interested in that. Some other things that are kind of writer-related things. I'm going to talk a little bit about, Captain Kidd, who he was and where he's from, without kind of getting in too much detail, because of course I want you to buy the book and read it. So, but I am going to touch on that a little bit. I'm going to touch a little bit on his, he was a New Yorker, who was born in England, but really became a colonial American, living in the Caribbean and then, later New York. So he was a pretty prominent New York citizen. So I want to get into that a little bit because that's interesting to a lot of people. And he knew Boston well. So he clearly has a New England connection that we want to talk about a little bit too, to tie it into, since this is a New England event, we want to tie it into that too. I'm going to talk a little bit about Sarah Kidd, the woman behind the man in Captain Kidd's life. And then I'm going to talk about the Red Sea Men. So that's going to be kind of an interesting part of the Captain Kidd story. In the 1690s, the first gold rush in American history occurred in the 1690s of Captain William Kidd and other people who lived during those times in the early Age of Enlightenment. And what this involved, I'm going to get into details. Basically, plundering the ships in the Red Sea that were worth generally between 20 and 200 million dollars in today's dollars. So this was a major gold rush in American history, the first major gold rush in American history, and it was a huge event that pretty much took over the whole Atlantic seaboard, all the way from New Hampshire down to the Carolinas. So it's a big deal, and I'm going to talk about it in this presentation. I'm going to talk about the fateful voyage of Captain Kidd. So you can cue the soundtrack. I can talk about it, but I'm going to try and not talk about it too much for the people, because we know we're going to probably at least have half or more who probably are, haven't read the book or just bought the book or maybe are thinking about buying the book, and I don't want to spoil it for those people. So we're going to tiptoe around the mega details a little bit. Again, there's Captain Kidd. If you don't know already, he basically is single-handedly inspired virtually every treasure myth in global history. People are still fanatically looking for his treasure today. So we're going to talk about that stuff. And of course, I grew up with those kind of stories, which some are wildly, inaccurate, and some are sort of, have a little bit of grain of truth to them. And then I'm not actually going to do a book reading. That's kind of from my other presentations that I give at bookstores. So I'm not going to do that. So why did I write a book about the notorious arch pirate Captain Kidd? Well, because he's my ninth great grandfather on my father's side, the Marquis side of Austin Marquis. I grew up with these stories and started in the late 60s because we had some family genealogists that I had these stories, but they were all just, he was somewhere between an Errol Flynn type swashbuckler and sort of a rogue. But remember, because it was our family history, we always sort of softened him a little bit. And, he was a handsome rogue and a vivacious, spirited guy and kind of an Errol Flynn type swashbuckler. So it's like, well, I didn't really, when you're a kid, you just dress up like a pirate and you don't think that much of it. But apparently, here's a picture of me in college. Apparently, I was dressing like a pirate, at an earlier age, at least somewhat. So it was always in, these family stories that I grew up with. And then, later was sort of cemented by Dr. David Boyles and his research. So I grew up with these stories, but they weren't accurate. They were kind of a joke. So when I set off on this mission to write this book, I kind of went in not knowing what to expect. I just, in terms of people like the author angle stuff, so I get into that a little bit in these book presentations that I do at bookstores and stuff. So part of the thing that had an influence on me, besides the fact that I grew up with these little stories that were pretty much not really that accurate, was the fact my grandfather had a place on St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. He was Elmer Pearson from Kansas City. He was a Swedish guy, fought in World War I. He has a picture with jodhpur trousers that Patton wore in World War I. So he was this kind of cool, interesting guy. But we used to go like every third year, our family, at Christmas to St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. So here's a picture of me when I was 5 years old. I guess, I don't know. Mina, can they see my arrow? They're seeing that, right?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, good. I'm going to use the arrow then. That I just had to make sure. I wasn't sure because I'm controlling the thing. Good. Okay, so here's a picture of me in Christiansted, St. Croix, Virgin Islands, the town of Christiansted. Well, has an incredible history for piracy and privateering, and a lot of interesting colonial Americans too. So this had an influence on me. I didn't really realize it till I wrote a book on Blackbeard, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, and this book on Captain Kidd now. But I grew up, in Christiansted has a piratey flavor, and I loved going there when I was a kid. I'd go there from Colorado. And for me, a Colorado, cowboy kid who grew up in a dusty old cow town, Bronco fan, this was a big deal to go to St. Croix. We went like every third year. And so I'd be around this architecture. There's a lot of piratey stuff there. The hotel's the Buccaneer. You walk down the streets here, you can see this kind of piratey architecture, the big swinging doors, big ceiling fans that, obviously back in the pirate era, they didn't have those. But here's the fort. This is Fort Christiansted that was there, built early. It was there in the 1600s. and definitely by the early 1700s. So the town of Christiansted was, played a role in me. Here's me with my sons, like 30 years later in the same place. You can see this port of Buckeye, or this island. This isn't Buck Island, but this is the island right off Christiansted. Is right here. And then here's me and my sons there. I took them back there and kind of took them through all this stuff. So it's sort of, I just wanted to let this is what really kind of helped my little piratey stuff when I was a kid, and because I just loved going to St. Croix. So that's really the gist of it. So that played a role in it. Here I have my little pirate maps, and I used to get little lead soldiers there, pirates and kind of colonial American soldiers, because I was kind of like a little history buff. So all of this played a big role in this kind of piratey stuff that I only am kind of now realizing. So who was Captain Kidd, and what, I'm gonna do the quickie notes version. But basically, he was born in 1654 in Soham, England, to a Protestant Christian family. But he went at an early age. He has a very strong Scottish connection. And he went at an early age to the port town of Dundee. So he might, at exactly what age, we don't know exactly, but he was there at an early age. And at some point, he became, there's not a lot known about his early years, but basically, at some point, he became a cabin boy or an apprentice in the port town of Dundee, and sailed to the Caribbean. Now, he was literate. If you look at Captain Kidd's letters, he was a pretty literate guy. He had a succinct writing style. He wrote concisely, and he was a pretty smart guy. He knew his language, so he could read and write. He was trained in mathematics and navigation. He went to the Caribbean at an early age. We don't know exactly when, but by his early teens, he was probably definitely in the Caribbean. And he served it probably as a merchant seaman, or apprentice originally. And at some point, he became a Caribbean buccaneer. So the Caribbean buccaneers were not pirates. A lot of, we always try and make them out to be pirates, and Henry Morgan and those, but were they piratey? Yes, they were absolutely piratey. But the difference back then in the golden age of piracy, which went from 1650 to 1730, a lot of scholars can't really agree on that exact date, but David Cordingley and Marcus Rediker and a few other people kind of come up with this 1650 to 1730, which is kind of what I'm sticking with. But there's three subdivisions within that golden age of piracy. The first were the Caribbean buccaneers. And yes, were they pirates? No, they weren't pirates. They were licensed privateers who stuck it to Imperial Spain and to a lesser extent the Portuguese. Were they rum-swilling drunks and wild, rebellious guys who fought and chased women? Yeah, absolutely. Just like every seaman on the face of the planet for the last, 3,000 years. So they technically, were very pirate-like. They inhabited, first started off as the Boucaniers on the French island of Hispaniola and Tortuga and those islands there. And they started out as just hide hunters. So they're hunting wild boars and wild cattle and wild animals, taking the hides and making money just as hide hunters in an all-male environment that was wild. They would drink too much, and they would do all the things that men do when they get with other men and kind of do bad things. But those guys were originally just hide hunters. So they lived on the islands. At some point, though, they got more English and Dutch contingent joining these French boucaniers. And so they, at some point, kind of, once Jamaica was taken over by the British from the Spanish in 1655, they got a large number of Dutch and English volunteers that were joining these French boucaniers and evolving into the pirates in the wickedest city on earth, Port Royal, Jamaica, which started in 1655. So that got taken over in the later 1650s, 1660s, 1670s, 1680s. When Captain Kidd was there, that was the time of the Buccaneers, the Caribbean Buccaneers. So they were not the villains of all nations, because they were selectively sticking it to Imperial Spain and to a lesser extent the Portuguese. Some of them violated their commissions, clearly. Some of the commissions were not fully valid. But most of them, in general, were privateers who were licensed and fighting for imperial, in different countries under the colonial governors of Jamaica and also Hispaniola, French Hispaniola. So that's the first era of the golden age of piracy, the Caribbean buccaneers from around 1650 to 1689. During the latter part of that is when Captain Kidd went to the Caribbean. So he was a buccaneer, Caribbean buccaneer, Captain Kidd. In the 1690s, the second era of the golden age of piracy is the Red Sea Men era. Now, I'm going to get into that and show some maps. It's going to help see it a little better. But in general, they were basically colonial Americans for the most part, and some British, and some other countries to a much lesser extent, European countries, who would go sail to the Indian Ocean and attack in the shipping of the Red Sea and along the Malabar coast of India. And they would take ships worth, sometimes some of them were cheap ships, but most of the big ships that belonged to the Great Mughal of India, King Aurangzeb I, were worth between $20 and $200 million in today's dollars. These were astronomical. So people were going all over colonial America, Newport, Rhode Island, Boston, the Carolinas, Philadelphia, but primarily New York and Newport were the two places where they were sailing out and attacking the ships of the Great Mughal of India from American ports with licenses to fight the French up in Newfoundland and off the Canadian coast. But they would violate those licenses and go to the Indian Ocean. So we're going to talk about that because that was really Captain Kidd's era. The villains of all nations that we're most familiar with is the last third group of pirates of the golden age of piracy. They came way late. So most of our images of pirates come from Blackbeard, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, Stede Bonnet, Black Sam Bellamy, who's famous in New England, who crashed his ship off the Cape Cod. So those that we got. Who else do we got? We got Calico Jack Rackham. Everyone in Black Sails. That Black Sails is really the most accurate pirate show and movie ever made. So if you want to see what pirates were really like, for the most part, not completely, Black Sails is the best show to watch. It's really good. And so that covers all of those guys. Blackbeard's in it, Calico Jack Rackham's in it, Anne Bonny's in it, all those people. And that's the villains of all nations era from really, I'm calling it 1706 to 1730 just because the Red Sea Men era was over by then, but it really was mostly from about 715 to 1725. And that's when the villains of all nations, the pirates, were taking every kind of ship, and colonial Americans were now by this point attacking them. The aristocracy was not going to take having their ships taken during the last stage of the golden age of piracy. So my first book that I wrote about pirates was a book on Blackbeard. Now, I went to the Outer Banks in around 2010 for a family vacation. And it was raining one day, and we were up by the Wright brothers up in the northern part of the Outer Banks. And I needed a book. And I was like, so it was a rainy day, which the Wright brothers thing. So I went and I grabbed this book on Blackbeard by this guy, Kevin Duffus. And I couldn't put it down. It was like, oh my God, this is really interesting. So even though I grew up with all these pirate stories and things as a kid, that kind of, disappeared for a long time until I came back and saw this book by Kevin Duffus on Blackbeard. It's kind of a picture book, so it has a lot of, cool images in it and a detailed story. And it's a little different interpretation of really where Blackbeard came from that I don't necessarily agree with that, but it's an incredible book and a beautiful, well-written book. So I read this book and I couldn't put it down. Then we kind of like the Outer Banks, my wife and family. So we would go back there for these family vacations, kind of from 2010 till maybe 2017. Well, when we went back, like I think our third visit, I went to where Blackbeard fought his last battle. It's off. If you ever go, it looks like it did exactly back in the day. So if you go on Ocracoke Island, you can look offshore about 100 yards, 150 yards. You can see where Blackbeard fought his last battle. So I would go out there I did a couple little pilgrimages out to Blackbeard. But then the last time I was there with my wife on this trip here, that you can see us together, in 2017, in August of 2017, I was like, well, you know what? It's the 300th anniversary of Blackbeard's death. Do you think I should write a book on Blackbeard? And up to that point, I've been writing kind of environmental thrillers, and history books on World War II was kind of my focus. And she's like, you got to write the book. It's coming out. Get busy. What are you going to do? So on this trip, I decided to write this book on Blackbeard, and it ended up being a Kirkus Review's best book for August of 2018. So that's kind of gives a little a little bit of background on the golden age of piracy, and kind of my interest in pirates and little family kind of connection. But really, Captain Kidd we're going to get back to Captain Kidd now. In the Caribbean, Captain Kidd, here's Port Royal, Jamaica here. So that's where he would have been his base when he went to the Caribbean, probably, in the late 1660s or early 1670s, when he was kind of a young cabin boy. So he would have been fighting against, been involved into the taking of Spanish ships, would have probably been doing some merchant runs too, because he later in his life became a merchant sea captain. So all of these things, Captain Kidd, grew up with in the Caribbean. So he sailed the Caribbean islands that he sailed in. He knew Antigua. He spent time in. He had been to St. Croix, which is showing here. He had been over in Jamaica. So he would have been involved in attacking ships in this entire area of the Caribbean Sea area. So Captain Kidd knew this area. And later, when he was he was a privateer at some point, beyond being an apprentice, and he's taking Spanish ships and maybe some Portuguese. And so this was at this time, Florida was controlled by the Spanish. St. Augustine was a Spanish stronghold. Cuba was controlled obviously by the Spanish. Hispaniola was kind of divided up into, a Spanish side on the eastern side, and on the French side, was kind of where the Buccaneers evolved, started over here. That was the French side of Hispaniola, which is modern day Haiti, to the west, and Dominican Republic to the east. So Captain Kidd knew all this area of the Caribbean by the 1670s and 1680s. Captain Kidd bought property in New York in 1688. Unlike a lot of his peers, fellow seamen of his age, he actually invested in real estate, by 1688, 1689, 1690, 1691. He had real estate in New York. So this is one of the famous paintings showing Captain Kidd. Captain Kidd never dressed like this. Okay. He did not look like this makes him look sort of like almost like a Spanish courtier. Captain Kidd usually had a blue jacket is what he wore. Yes, he carried a sword regularly, so that's accurate. But he probably normally would have had white stockings and a blue breeches and jacket. He would have had a velvet jacket and a linen jacket like this. He wore a tricorn hat. So all this is reasonably accurate. Sarah, probably this is not too far from what she looked like. So this is an image showing what was Fort James and later Fort William here, where Battery Park is today. There was a Dutch windmill on the island of New York in the 1680s and 1690s. So this isn't that far off of Captain Kidd entertaining in New York Harbor during the 1690s, where he lived. He had real estate. He owned several real estate properties in New York, where I'm going to show the Lower East Side. And he was a man of he had saved his money from his privateer earnings, and bought real estate instead of pissing it away on liquor and women, which was unusual for the time period, because most privateers and pirates and seamen were just spending their money, virtually as soon as they came back into port. So Captain Kidd's house that he lived in when he was married to Sarah, he married Sarah Bradley, who, when she was about 20, and he was like in his mid 30s. But they lived in Pearl Street by 1691. By May of 1691, they were married and lived in this house here, a 3-story mansion. This is showing the East River here. So he had prime real estate, and he owned 5 other properties too in New York, all in this area here within about 5 blocks of his primary residence. So this is at 119, 121 Pearl Street, which also turns into Dock Street as you go further north up here. But this is showing the wall here. This would be Wall Street. So modern day Wall Street would run right along here up to Broadway, which would be up here. So back then it was called Broadway, not Broadway. And the Wall Street, there was a wall, there was a footpath that became Wall Street on the other side of this wall here. So this wall was built to keep out the Puritans, New England Puritans, and Native American Algonquins tribes, and those tribes they were trying to keep out of, because New Amsterdam was Dutch then. So starting in 1625, New York was controlled by the Dutch through the Dutch West India Company. And basically up until 1664, the Dutch controlled the colony of New Netherland, which would have been New York colony, and the town of New York, which was New Amsterdam then. So by this time, when Captain Kidd was there, it was New York, because it was changed over. The changeover occurred in 1664. But he had prime real estate. He had a crane to bring up on the 3rd floor so he could haul goods up. I don't know what, they're not showing the crane here, but this was his house. This is reasonable facsimile of his house then, where he lived with Sarah. So he was right on the East River. Since this time, this Pearl Street is now 3 blocks in. So because of landfilling all around Manhattan on the East River and the Hudson and on the South side, they built out 3 blocks. So his prime real estate on the East River, overlooking the East River, is no longer there today. It's 3 blocks inland. So his location, Captain Kidd's home, and some of his other properties would be all in this area in here, south of Wall Street, right here. But his house was right along in here. Captain Kidd's house is right along here. They're calling it Dock Street, but it was still called Pearl Street back then. And this is really became Dock Street further up here, north of Captain Kidd. So in any case, back then, in Captain Kidd's era in the 1690s, there were only 5,000 people lived in New York. So there were, mostly Dutch, or at least half Dutch, but a lot of English, French. There were Walloons, who were kind of Belgians. And, there were 700 Africans, some free, and most of them were enslaved, though. So it was a very multi-ethnic environment that Captain Kidd and Sarah Kidd lived in their house here on Pearl Street. And so this is showing around 1700. This is probably a little bit later than really Captain Kidd's era. It's probably a little, it's going circa 1700. But this is generally what it looked like. So the fort would have been down here. The Great Dock would have been here. This would have been the, New York harbors out here. Captain Kidd's house is right here. Wall Street right here. Here's Broadway. Trinity Church is built right in here. So Trinity Church, the church, I think the graveyard for Trinity Church is right over here. So all of that, Trinity Church was built in 1696 through 1698. And Captain Kidd did help build Trinity Church too. So he was a community leader, wasn't a pirate. So Captain Kidd moves back, New York. He was there by 1688, but he was at sea fighting against the French in King William's War, which began from 1689 to 1697. English and the Dutch Republic fought against France and Imperial France. And so Captain Kidd was a privateer, licensed privateer, with a commission from the crown to fight against the French from 1689 through 1691. In 1691, he became a merchant seaman. So from 1691 to 1695, he and Sarah are living in New York, and he's a merchant captain sailing to and from the Caribbean and making good money as a commercial sea captain in the merchant trade. So, but he was privateering, fighting against the French on behalf of the English from 1689 to 1691 for that 3-year period in there. In 1691, he returned to New York and married Sarah. whom he knew, he had a previous romantic relationship with, and they kind of reconnected after her first husband, William Cox, died. He was a rich, it was a forced marriage by her father. And she married him, but he ended up in a drowning incident in 1689. So she was no longer married to him, and she was also married to a guy named John Ort, who was a Dutchman before Captain Kidd. So Captain Kidd was actually her third husband, but they knew each other from before. So the Red Sea men era began in the early 1690s, and involved sailing from ports that I said before, Boston, I mean, primarily New York and Newport, but also a little bit from Boston and a little bit maybe from Philadelphia and Charleston, but mostly New York and Newport. They would sail across the Atlantic from these North American ports. Sometimes they would sail out of England too, others, and they would go and seize the ships sailing south here along this path from Madeira Islands, Cape Verde Islands, and then head towards the Brazilian coast before swinging over. And they would go to Madagascar here. This is the big island of Madagascar, and would be kind of the base of these pirates. And then they would attack the ships off the Red Sea at the Bab el Mandeb, which is a choke point for shipping for these ships, these East Indian ships that belong to the Great Mughal of India and other wealthy merchants of India. So these ships, like I said before, would be worth $20 to $200 million. A lot of them were part of the Hajj, which were basically they would sell East Indian products, silks, and all the things of the East, and all the fabrics of the East, saltpeter, and a lot of other things that they would get from India. They would sail to the Red Sea. These were Muslims. So the Great Mughal of India was a Muslim leader, and they would sail for the annual gathering in usually July and August, or even June through August, called the Hajj, where they would go to Mecca to pray, which they still do today. Obviously, Muslims throughout the world go to this. It's a huge event. So the Great Mughal of India would finance these incredible ships. Merchants would go aboard and pilgrims to go to pray. And they would go, from these ports here in India to Jeddah, and then they'd go walk, to Mecca at that point by camel or whatever, by horse or camel or other means. They would go pray and trade, and they would come back with gold, silver, and all kinds of other things from Turkish merchants and Arabian merchants, and other merchants too, maybe African merchants too, who would gather in these places, and they would bring treasure ships that were worth, like I said, $20 to $200 million back to Indian ports. Well, that's when the pirates would wait right here in the at the Bab el Mandeb, and they would attack these ships. So the people that would attack these ships, right here, this is showing an enlargement of this. So you can see they would sail to Jeddah here, and then they'd come back through the Gulf of Aden and the Arabian Sea to these ports here in the Indian coast. Well, they would be attacked by the pirates, the most famous of which, well, this is showing some images of these pirates. They were multi-ethnic. There were some, Captain Kidd, for instance, had African American seamen. He had Native American seamen. So he had a multi-ethnic group of seamen, Captain Kidd. Now, Captain Kidd was sent to the Indian Ocean to hunt pirates. He wasn't a pirate himself. So, but this is showing kind of what they look. And obviously these are kind of romanticized images of pirates. But the first of these pirates was a guy named Thomas Tew. He was a Rhode Island gentleman who in 1693 got a commission from the governor of Bermuda, Governor Richer, and he came back and got a crew, from Bermuda and Rhode Island and colonial Americans. He sailed to the Indian Ocean with a privateer license to go hunt French up in Canada. Because remember, this was King William's War. English America is fighting the French. So they would, in the 1690s, guys like Thomas Tew, who's shown here with Governor Fletcher of New York, who's the governor of New York, who's giving commissions to privateers, is commissioned. Thomas Tew is commissioned to go hunt French shipping up off the coast of Newfoundland and in the St. Lawrence River, and that area. Well, what does he do? He goes straight to the Indian Ocean. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Goes straight to the Indian Ocean to hunt down shipping here. Well, in 1693, he takes a ship that's worth like, I think over $100 million. I think in today's dollars, actually over $120 million. So Thomas Chew, with only 60 seamen, sails to the Indian Ocean, hits a gold mine by taking a great ship belonging to the Great Mogul of India, and he sails, takes that ship, sails back to Madagascar here at St. Mary's Island off the north, the north east coast of Madagascar, and then he sails back to Newport, Rhode Island, and he brings $120 million in. He's hailed as a hero. Thomas Chew, he's a Rhode Island gentleman. He has a wife and daughters. They meet him at the docks, and he's made $120 million. All of his individual seamen are all getting over $1 million each. So this is the first gold rush in American history. Individual seamen, and we're talking about poor seamen, tradesmen, farmers, not all of them had seafaring experience, are going to the Indian Ocean and taking these treasure ships from the Great Mogul of India that are worth, tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. It's crazy. So he comes back, and their crews look somewhat like this, yeah, a little bit romanticized, but kind of gives you sort of the action-packed flavor of what these guys are doing. And then Thomas Chew sails back. Well, like I said, it creates a gold rush. So by 1694, colonial America, from all the way from Charleston up to New Hampshire, people are just going into Newport and New York in droves to get on these ships that are sailing to the Indian Ocean, because overnight you can go from being a poor, out of work guy to being a millionaire. By hundreds of them. We're talking about even thousands of these guys by the end of the decade. So this is a gold rush. It's unregulated because no one is controlling it yet at this point. Well, in 1695, Captain Kidd, who's been a merchant seaman for the last 4 years, and an occasional privateer taking French ships, because he's still once in a while is taking French ships, but he's getting rich as a merchant seaman, living in New York, has the most beautiful English woman, Sarah Bradley Kidd, who's his wife. He has 2 beautiful daughters that he loves that are like young girls born in 1692, 1694. And he's wealthy. He's well-liked. He's a jury foreman. Everything's going right for Captain Kidd. He decides to go to London because he wants to have a taste of what it was like to be a commissioned privateer again. But he wants to get a crown commission as a royal privateer, because he probably wants a last taste of glory. He's getting a little older now. He's approaching, he is 40. He's over 40 now, which, is old back then, or older at least. So Captain Kidd decides to go in June of 1695 to London to get a crown commission to fight the French. He doesn't want to fight pirates. He doesn't want to hunt pirates. But he's a licensed crown privateer. He's never been a pirate in his life to this point at all. He's been a licensed privateer. He's a war hero. He's a jury foreman. He's one of the richest guys in New York. He's married to one of the most important, beautiful socialites in all of New York. So he sails there, and who does he meet? He meets his friend Robert Livingston, who's a New Yorker, and he gets roped into this by Lord Belmont, who has been earmarked to be the royal governor of New York, Massachusetts Bay Colony, and New Hampshire, which are at this point are going to be joined by 1697 under Lord Belmont, this guy right here. Captain Kidd doesn't want to do it. He tries to back out of it. He wants a crown commission to fight the French only. He gets that commission, but Lord Belmont threatens to take his ship and threatens to impress him and his seamen if he doesn't agree to go to the Indian Ocean to hunt down pirates. King William III gets a 10% cut. He's involved in this thing. And 4 of the most important Whig ministers, the Duke of Shrewsbury, Admiral Russell, the Duke of Romney, and Lord Somers, the top the top legal official in all of England, are involved in this adventure for Captain Kidd to go hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean and fight the French, which all Captain Kidd wants to do is do that. But he's threatened by Lord Belmont, who's a partner. So all of these Whig lords and the king are basically Captain Kidd's partner. Here's Kidd in London at the time. And so he gets involved in this scheme that he really wasn't really want to be a part of, through his friend Robert Livingston, who's a wealthy Scotsman who lives in New York at the time. So he's roped into this thing, goes back to New York. So, well, here's the commission that he has from the King of England. So it's William III calls Captain Kidd the trusty and well-beloved Captain Kidd in this thing. So Captain Kidd, the most famous pirate today, along with Blackbeard, we'll call it co-honors, is under this, with the four most important Whig lords in England and the king, the trusty and well-beloved Captain Kidd is sent off on an impossible mission that he didn't want to do, to go hunt down pirates in the Indian Ocean. And here's, his license from the King of England himself. So they built him a ship in London in 1690, late 1695, early 1696. They built him the 34-gun adventure galley, shown here, and it has 34 guns, and it also has 46 galley oars, 23 on each side. So it's a powerful gunship. It's not, it's probably like the equivalent of a English Royal Navy third rate, so or even fourth rate. So it's a powerful ship, though. It's no slouch. And they build this ship for him. It costs, 6,000 pounds. Captain Kidd's a partner. He gets a good cut, but he's roped into this. He didn't want to go. So he goes back to New York in the summer of 1696, because he wants to see his wife and daughters, and he still has to round out his seamen. He doesn't have enough seamen. He only has around 70, and he has to go get 80 more in New York. So he goes to recruit them to visit his wife and daughters. He's got this new big ship, so he's the talk of the town. He helps build Trinity Church right here that you can still see today. The first it's burned down a couple times and been beveled, so it's on its like fourth incarnation. But the original Trinity Church, Captain Kidd helped build by loaning his runner and tackle to build the beautiful church shown here. For that, he was rewarded by giving a subscription to the church, which was being built from 1696 to 1698. He gets pew number 4 right up front. The most famous pirate of all time is right here up front with the rector in pew number 4. You can see it right here. Kidd's name is right here, and his family. So Kidd and Sarah and their 2 daughters go to church at Trinity Church. Well, it was just being built that summer, though, so he's not going there yet. Okay, so in any case, he returns to New York, and then he's got to go get all these sailors. So he hires his sailors to go to the Indian Ocean to hunt down pirates, not a pirate. So where does he go? He follows the traditional route that all the pirates take, all the Red Sea men that he's out to hunt. So he's there to hunt. Thomas Tew is written on his license. So his privateering commission says, go get Thomas Tew. Go get Captain Wake. Go get these other captains and any other pirates. He also has a French commission to attack French ships. So he has 2 commissions. So he sails down to Madeira Islands. Of course, he's got to restock on fine Madeira wine. So he gets a few hundred barrels of wine there. Heads to the Cape Verde Islands, and then all slingshots over to the South American coast of Brazil. And then he heads to Madagascar. There's a lot of things that happen on the way that I'm not going to get into, because hopefully I don't want to spoil it for those who are going to read the book. But the bottom line is he goes to Madagascar, which is the same route that all the mariners take who go to the Indian Ocean. Sorry, my phone's ringing there, and I don't think I can turn it off. It's going to ring, unfortunately. So hopefully that's not too loud for you. I'll try and talk loud over it. So in any case, he sails to the Madagascar, and then he goes and he hunts down. He's basically hunting down pirate ships. So he ends up taking legally. This is showing the Indian Ocean again. So he first sails from Tulare north to the islands here. He loses like 35 crewmen to tropical disease, and then he heads here to hunt down pirates as they're taking the ships of the Great Mughal and other Muslim shipping. So he's involved here. It takes him, basically a year to get to the Indian Ocean here. And he's looking for pirate ships and French ships. So he's hunting both because the French have a big stake in India too. They're really between England, France, and the Dutch are the three most prominent Europeans in India at that time. The Portuguese by that time are kind of a waning empire. So Captain Kidd's hunting ships here, trying to hunt pirate ships here or French vessels. So he ends up taking a number of ships, but he lets them go, except for two of them. So the two ships he takes are the Quedagh Merchant, which is worth between $60-70 million and $100 million in today's dollars. So he ends up taking the ship, but it presents French passes, which makes it a 100% legal acquisition by Captain Kidd, because when you present papers, that's what country the ship belongs to back in Captain Kidd's day. So this ship here, the Quedagh Merchant, was worth a lot of money, but the captain presented French papers. Captain Kidd took it 100% legally by the legal standards of his era. He also took another ship called the Betrayal. During his voyage, though, by this time he's got 3 ships under his command. And one of the other ships, the crew of the Betrayal, he puts kind of his bad apples on that ship. Well, that ship did take another ship, a Spanish galleot, without his approval. And Captain Kidd, by that point, has a mutinous crew because it's a voyage from hell. He's had tropical disease. He's had all kinds of storms. He's been attacked by the Moors, who are the Muslim East Indians. He's been attacked by even the East India Company. And the voyage is a disaster. They haven't made any money, and they haven't earned any money hunting pirates or French. And so he has half, or probably 3/4 of the crew by this time is completely mutinous, and there's no way he can really keep them under control. So he takes these ships legally and decides, well, we've made enough money. I can go back legally since I took these ships legally. But when he goes to Madagascar, here, St. Mary's Island, 97 of his crewmen mutiny because they've been completely disgruntled. And he ends up taking the Quedagh Merchant pretty late after he's been in the Indian Ocean for 9 months and with nothing. And they've been on half rations, no water, no money. They're being hounded. The crew's has some kind of mutinous crewmen. So they fully mutiny on St. Mary's Island, 97 of them. And he's left with less than 20 loyalists who were kind of the non-piratical faction who stayed with Captain Kidd. Well, he sails back to colonial America. And so I'm not going to give it away because I don't want to give away the book, and becomes the most wanted man in the world. And he gets involved in the trial of the century. So this image here is showing Captain Kidd going before the House of Commons in March of 1701. And here's this is a picture by Howard Pyle, who's a very famous pirate artist, showing Captain Kidd, of course, looking like a Spanish swashbuckler here, burying treasure on what looks like a deserted island. Now, Captain Kidd did, in fact, bury some treasure, and he gave a treasure to a number of people, but he did it purely because he didn't trust Lord Belmont, who was his sponsor in the Indian Ocean voyage, who is now the governor of New York, Massachusetts Bay Province, and New Hampshire. So Captain Kidd returns from his voyage to the Indian Ocean that took place from September 1696 to July of 1699. So 2 years and 2 3/4 years. When he returns to America, he reunites with Sarah and his daughters, and he goes to Boston. And Lord Belmont's in Boston at that point. He's left New York, so he's operating as the governor of New England. Of Massachusetts Bay at this point, but he's still overseeing New York and New Hampshire too. So he lures Kidd into Boston by saying that he will give him a pardon. And he lures him there. Captain Kidd has the best 2 lawyers in colonial America, James Emont of New York and Thomas Newton in Boston, who was a prosecutor in the Salem witch trials. He's Captain Kidd's lawyer in Boston. So, but by then, Captain Kidd's a wanted man. He's wanted. He learns that when he came back to the Caribbean on his way back to America in 1699. So he tries to strike a deal with Belmont and say, look, I took these ships legally. They had French passes, but it doesn't matter because the Indian Ocean piracy is too big a deal. The Great Mughal of India is gone ballistic. The King of England's up in arms. The Whig ministers who are involved in Captain Kidd's deal and his supporters who said they had his back are just running for cover. No one wants to touch Captain Kidd. He's persona non grata in colonial America. So when he comes back to colonial America, he does bury some treasure or store some treasure on Gardiner's Island, which is at the entrance of Long Island Sound. He does store some with Thomas Paine, Captain Thomas Paine in Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island. And he also leaves it with Thomas Clark, Captain Thomas Clark, his friend in New York, who has a place in Stamford, Connecticut, where he keeps stuff. So back in this era, merchant seamen, privateers who are licensed pirates in a way, Royal Navy officers, there's not much difference between them. Colonial Americans, they don't consider piracy a crime. Only the English crown does. Most colonial Americans are like, they're bringing money into colonial America. They're bringing gold and silver and goods. We don't care about piracy. So Captain Kidd, though, because he did bury some treasure on Gardiner's Island, has spawned every myth of pirates. Here's another image here by Howard Pyle. You can see the initials here, who always makes him have a Spanish flavor. Captain Kidd never wore anything remotely like this. So all these myths of, look at here, he's a roguish Captain Kidd. All of these are created from Captain Kidd because he didn't trust Lord Belmont. He stashed his loot, legally gotten loot with a number of people in Long Island Sound, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. So today I'm going to jump here because I'm not giving away too much of the book. Captain Kidd in popular culture, he would have been shocked. He's everywhere now. As I say in the back of my book, I have about a 20-minute kind of summary of the legend of Captain Kidd and all the stories he spawned, from treasure hunting mythology to all these other things in pop culture. But one of the things that always irritates me is, of all the actors to play Captain Kidd, Charles Laughton was sort of a tubby guy in the 1950s and 1960s. We need someone better to play Captain Kidd. Chris Hemsworth needs to be the Captain Kidd for the Captain Kidd movie. This guy right here looks like Gene Wilder and Young Frankenstein. So, we don't want him to playing Captain Kidd. But the point is that Captain Kidd has been everywhere. There's taverns named after him in London. There's Captain Kidd's in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. There's a Captain Kidd's restaurant that I go to out in Hermosa Beach, California. It's one of my favorite places. There's roads named after him, hotels named after him. There's a rock and roll band. There's a Captain Kidd rock and roll band. He's everywhere in pop culture today, which is which is the most ironic thing. He's known as the most famous pirate of all time, but he was never a pirate. So here's the Captain Kidd I go to out in California. It's like he never went to California. There's no Captain Kidd. He might have made it to the Pacific or the South Sea, it was called back then, but it's doubtful. But there's toy figure Captain Kidds everywhere. There's probably, he didn't scowl like this. Captain Kidd was a good guy. He lived in New York. He was a jury foreman and a leading citizen. Here he is in the real history. They always make him a kind of a pirate, but this one, they do make him a little more upstanding here. So this is probably a little closer to what he actually looked like. His wig, I think, though, was chestnut brown, though, based on his one painting. So here's Captain Kidd's in Wapping, which has important significance because that's where Captain Kidd met his demise, which I think a lot of people probably know that, so I'm not spoiling that. But in any case, he is everywhere in pop culture, which is kind of, so as I say in my book, perhaps Captain Kidd has had the last laugh on us all. So that's the end. It's probably not too much detail, but gives you kind of an overview. So now I think we can go to questions and talk about the real Captain Kidd and mythology and whatever you want.
Thanks, Sam. That was really fascinating. No idea about a lot of that. So I do have a few questions here. Somebody asked, what did you think of the portrayal of Captain Kidd in Plum Island by Nelson DeMille, if you read it?
I didn't read that, but I did know that Captain Kidd is, the is in the book. I think it's pretty treasury. I think it's probably a lot of the Captain Kidd mythology, which I love. It's interesting. I just read
Hmm.
a thing the other day where they said in Lake George they're drudging up Captain Kidd's treasure. Well, there's no connection to Lake George from the Hudson River, so these stories are incredibly fun, amusing. So, but
Hmm.
it's probably pretty good. I'm sure Nelson DeMille gets a lot of things right, but I think a lot of Captain Kidd's stories are really the mythology. You know.
Hmm.
So I
Um,
haven't read the book. I can't comment.
I just want to remind everybody, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your screen. Sam, can you stay an extra few minutes if we have a few more
Oh
questions?
yeah, no, I stay as long as you want.
Okay, thanks. Maybe 10, 15. Carl asks, is Captain Kidd's house at 121 Pearl Street still standing?
No, unfortunately, it's been long since gone. It's I can't remember what it is, but it's a giant building, and it's long gone.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, it's what, 400 years?
But I will say
Um,
one thing, and I've
mhm.
said this in a lot of my talks. If I today had all of Captain Kidd's properties were all tainted and taken from Sarah. So Sarah, you get a lot of Sarah in my book because she's an amazing woman, my ninth great grandmother. So one of the things though is that if Captain Kidd's properties were around today, they'd be worth about $500 million.
Oh,
All
wow.
of them, seven of them, because they're all on the Lower East Side. He had one that would be his farm that he and Sarah co-owned, together. But under English law, remember, Captain Kidd owned everything. But she brought something to the marriage, but he was already wealthy. But when they combined it, they were both very wealthy. Would be about a third of North Central Park. Captain Kidd owned that. So he owned prime real estate in the Lower East Side, basically.
Wow. Well, that's amazing. Um, Karen asks, have you talked with L8N MJ Manuel Miranda about making the We're Not Kidding music CD at all?
No, I haven't, but that sounds interesting. What was that again?
I'm not sure they spelled it right, but it says L8NMJ Manuel Miranda. So I'm thinking Lin Manuel Miranda about making the We're Not Kidding music CD.
No, I don't have any plans to do that, but that sounds interesting.
um, Dennis wants to know, and I do too, if there's any buried treasure still out there.
Okay, now this is the funny thing is I get this question all the time. And I don't it's one of those things that I hate to be Debbie Downer because people are so into it. So in some ways I want to finesse it a little bit, but I got to be honest. Captain Kidd, when he returned, the treasure that he buried was at Gardner's Island. Okay, he did bury treasure there with John Gardner, who fully approved. He hung out with John Gardner. They hit it off. They sat on and had hard cider aboard Captain Kidd's ship, and John Gardner agreed to hide some of Kidd's. We're calling it treasure, but it was legally seized plunder from a treasure ship, but it was legal what he took. Um, he did bury some there. Unfortunately, Lord Belmont, who was a bloodhound, who was the royal governor at that point, was in Boston, pretty much tracked down virtually all of the treasure. Captain Kidd stored most of it in like five different places. So Gardner's Island, he left some with John Gardner, but he also buried some. He left it also with his friend Captain Thomas Pay in Narragansett Bay. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but Rhode Island. So, not too far from Newport. He also left with Captain Thomas Clark, who was his New York friend who picked up Sarah and their daughters and brought them to Captain Kidd to off the shore Block Island. Um, and he also stored it with him, who then stored it in Stamford, Connecticut. Lord Belmont pretty much tracked almost all of that down. Captain Kidd had some with him too. That was all seized because that was with Sarah. So that was taken from Sarah. people today are still going all over the Indian Ocean, Madagascar, the Caribbean. So, there's been voyages. It's all in my book too. At the last 20 pages, I get into all this, the mythology, because I think it's really interesting. People have sailed to Thailand and in the Great China Sea to find his treasure. I mean, people are still doing this stuff. Is there any really? I guess I can't say 100%. Most of it was taken. Was there more? Maybe. I don't know. Does that sound vague? Appropriately vague?
It's a good opportunity to take our metal detector out of our library of things, though. Just saying. Um, so Brienne asks, and a couple other people have asked about descendants. So you're the ninth great grandson, and I know that Sarah and Captain Kidd had two daughters.
Yeah.
Are there many other descendants?
No. Well, they had two daughters and a son. They had a son it's in my book, out of wedlock. So that was given up for adoption because Sarah was not married at that point with Captain Kidd. So they had at least three. I don't know. They might have had more, but those are the three that we know about.
Mm-hmm. Um, and do we know anything about the sailor that Captain Kidd killed, age, background, anything like that?
Yes, we do. We know a lot about him, and I didn't get into that, but we can talk about him. His chief gunner was William Moore. So Captain Kidd hired him in 1696 in New York. So William Moore had two prison sentences against his name. One for striking his captain before the voyage, and Kidd, I don't think Kidd knew because he still hired him. Or maybe Kidd didn't knew and gave him a second chance. We don't know. We don't know exactly. But William Moore attacked his captain in the Caribbean, or in New York actually, when he was a teenager. So he was like 19 or 20. I think he attacked him, and then when he was in prison for like drunk and disorderly or something like that in the Caribbean, and he was overheard threatening to go to the French side during the war. So he would switch sides and be a traitor. So he got in prison for that somehow, for being like he was kind of a loudmouth guy. So he was Kidd's gunner. Now he was the mutant leading the mutinies throughout Kidd's voyage. So from the very beginning, before they even reached the Madeira Islands, William Moore was kind of the lead insurrectionist because he wanted to have a Red Sea voyage. A lot of the guys did. Remember, these ships are worth a ton of money. Captain Kidd's crew was going to get 60% by the end, according to his commission. So they would get 60%, not 100%, like a pirate ship would get. So a pirate ship, the captain would get 3 shares. The chief mate and some of the key officers would get like 1.5 to 2 shares, and then the ordinary seaman would get 1 share. Or if they were like a cabin boy or apprentice, they might only get a half a share. On this ship, the crew and Kidd got a nice cut, 15% cut, along with Robert Livingston. But the crew would get, they would all get 1 share. So if they go tech, Captain Kidd's ship, they all got a good share, but it was all in cloth. So to answer the question, William Moore was his lead mutineer. Captain Kidd and him had been getting into it for months because William Moore is leading insurrection after insurrection. They finally got in a heated conversation, and Captain Kidd hit him with an empty wooden bucket, and William Moore did die. So Captain Kidd was guilty of either nothing at all, because remember, he was combating a mutiny. So Captain Kidd, according to the legal canons of his era, is guilty of at most nothing because he was fighting an insurrection, or manslaughter. Worst case scenario. In reality, he was tried, or convicted and hung for first-degree murder with a wooden bucket. I don't think there's anybody in the history of the planet who has premeditated murder with a wooden bucket. That's pretty far-fetched. So William Moore, Captain Kidd felt bad about it, but yes, he's guilty technically of either, manslaughter at worst case.
Mm-hmm.
That's true.
So I have a couple comments and questions more about buried treasure. Polly says there's a myth in my hometown of Milford, Connecticut that he landed there one evening and boldly kissed a young girl. Supposedly he buried treasure on an island on the coast there. Amazingly, or not, no one has ever found any treasure, but it's a good excuse to have a Pirates Day celebration every year. And then John,
Definitely, most definitely.
any good
So,
reason for Pirate Day?
well, it's also Captain Kidd was near there. So there's no question that, so let's just place him so we get the history right. Stanford, he gave a lot, millions of dollars of worth to Captain Thomas Clark, who did hide it in Stamford, Connecticut. He also went to, like I said, near Narragansett Bay. It's not too far from Connecticut, I believe, where she's talking about. He was there. Thomas Paine definitely stored it, but he stored the gold bars, which were later recovered by Sarah. Sarah sent someone to get it. She's there to save her man, Captain
Mm.
Kidd. So Sarah plays a huge role in my book, trying to save Captain Kidd. It's her husband. They're madly in love. It's one of the greatest New York love stories of all time. Captain Kidd and Sarah. So there is a grain of truth to what she's saying. I don't know. I can't say if it was, but if it's having a party for Captain Kidd, I'd love to be there.
Like I said, I will go to any Pirate Day. So on with the theme of buried treasure, John's asks, the Captain Kidd restaurant in Woods Hole was named for a local myth or legend that his treasure was buried nearby. Do you run into this story at all?
I don't, but I know that I know about Woods Hole Restaurant. I know it's good. Everybody says how good it was, and I want to go there sometime. I hope they, show my book up by the front register, though.
That would make sense, right? Carol says, whenever I've taken the Thimble Islands tour on Long Island Sound in Connecticut, the guide always talks about buried treasure on one of the islands that was buried by Captain Kidd. Is that a myth?
Well, no, that's probably Gardner's Island. That's the one place that Captain Kidd did bury treasure.
Ooh,
Absolutely true. But it was all found by Lord Belmont. We think.
okay.
We don't know that, is it possible? I don't know. Now,
All
Gardner
right.
Island, just so you know, is privately owned. So they've been there since literally the 1630s, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Lord Gardner was a Scottish engineer who built forts in the Connecticut coast. He was very prominent. So they're a very, old American family, that goes way back, and that's their island. I think, you can't really go there. You can't just say, hey, I'm going to Gardner's Island because they own it.
Um, Ellen says the Kid in Wood Holes is a lot of fun in the wintertime, so you should make a trip out there. And Karen says earlier she had said something about Lin-Manuel Miranda. She was saying, sort of maybe facetiously, maybe you should reach out to him to see if he would do a musical about Captain Kidd like Hamilton. That was
Hey,
that was that.
it sounds interesting. I loved Hamilton. I saw
Me too. Okay,
it.
last question.
Okay.
Amanda says, I don't completely understand why the various lords turned on Captain Kidd. Can you give us a little bit of a better sense of what happened there?
Yes, it's the thing is, my book gets into a lot of detail on all the backstabbing and treachery and the treasure and what really happened to what we know with what Captain Kidd got and and the reasoning behind it all. So it is the good thing is the book is 384 pages long, so it's chunky but not too chunky. So
Mhm.
you get a lot of this. You're going to get a lot of detail, and obviously the endnotes and bibliography have a lot of detail too, because I had to put some of that stuff in there because the publisher wants it to be narrative nonfiction. Let's go fast, you know. So, um, so you know, to answer that question about why they did it, the bottom line is when Captain Kidd left for the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea pirates, the Red Sea men were just getting started and starting to cause problems. By the time Captain Kidd was hunting that was there, basically the Great Mughal had reached his wits' end because the crown's not doing anything. The East India Company's not hunting down pirates. The English crown is doing a lot of talk, but they're not really doing much yet. They didn't do a lot till they sent Lord Belmont. Lord Belmont's the big anti-pirate crusader, and he doesn't go to America till April of 1698. So by the time Captain Kidd's in the Indian Ocean, he's just there at the wrong place at the wrong time. Because every Indian Ocean piracy by Thomas Chew, by Henry Avery, who's the grand pirate who got away with it all, but was really kind of a dirty guy who was, missed. They attacked a lot of ships and raped the women, and that was what Henry Avery did. Captain Kidd was set there to hunt down Henry Avery, Thomas Chew, and those guys. He was a law-abiding guy. So these guys have just, they have just raped and pillaged and taken these ships that are worth, so much money. They're going back to colonial America. The colonial governors there, remember, they're like, hey, you're bringing money into our ports. There's no banks in America then. So pirates and privateers are bringing all of the money, the gold and silver specie, into colonial Americas. This is a big deal. That's why colonial governors are all approving of piracy. They're not looking. They're more, people call it looking the other way. No, they just didn't see it as a crime. Most Americans didn't. They thought it was enriching the colony, taking it from Muslims from distant country who were, they weren't Protestants, they weren't Christians, and the Muslims thought just as badly of Christians. The bigotry went both ways. So the bottom line is, Captain Kidd took these ships that were so much money, and they didn't catch most of these other pirates. Henry Avery got away with it. That's the real problem. So Captain Kidd died for the sins of Henry Avery and the other pirates. That's the real story of Captain Kidd.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Oh my gosh. Well, we're going to have to read this book. And we do have it at the Ashland Library. You can certainly get it from your local library if you don't live near Ashland or in Ashland. But you can also buy signed books from Aesop's Fable. Somebody just asked me, Sam, if you actually sell the directly signed books on your website.
No, what we do is you can get it at any Barnes and Noble. You can get it at Hudson Booksellers. It's everywhere. The books, and not some are different than others. You can get it in every independent bookstore. It's in almost most libraries. But I will say, libraries, it's checked out. I've looked, and it's not people are not able to get it. So no, if you get the book, all you have to do is email me at samuelmarquisbooks@gmail.com. It's on my website. Send me an email, and I'll send you a book plate.
Mm-hmm.
Those are what I said at Aesop's. So I send people book plates is what I do. Because
yes.
It's not so nice, because then you can put it on what page you want. And it's got a cool little ship on it, a little logo. You just tell me what you want to write, and I'll send them to you. I'll be happy to do it.
Personalized books, can't beat that. Okay, everyone. Oh, will it be available in audio? That's a good question.
It is already available in audio. So if you go to, whatever, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, it's everywhere. It's out there. It's selling well, doing well because it's a good story. It's a real story. I want to say one more thing. I didn't go write this book to vindicate my ninth great grandfather. That's not what I just tried to be as sympathetic and write as good a book that's ever been written on Captain Kidd. To be honest with you, I still don't say he's innocent. At the end of the day, I say he's guilty of piracy because he at least looked the other way when one of his other ships, the November, which was the Ruparel that they changed the name, they took a Spanish galleot, and he was either so beat down by his crew, who was mutinous at that point, that he looked the other way. So he's guilty technically of piracy because he was just beat down, gave up, and he's guilty, worst case scenario, manslaughter for the death of William Moore, but no worse than that. And to be honest, in his time, most captains who actually killed a crewman that was mutinying, there would be no crime at all. So for him to even get manslaughter would be not right, really, because according to the legal tenets of the age, which is what we have to look at, Captain Kidd that would not be a crime.
Right.
So, but I say still technically it is. So I don't dare to go be the homeboy for my ninth great grandfather. I am sympathetic, and I try and talk about all sides because I think he's gotten the shaft. He's been a scapegoat of history, and his real story needs to be out there.
Mm-hmm. Well, we appreciate that sort of like almost the firsthand knowledge of it, since he was your ninth great grandfather. So thank you so much for your time, Sam. I really appreciate it. And I hope everybody gets to read this book because it's obviously fascinating. And, knowing that a descendant wrote it gives it that much more cachet, I think. So thank you again, Sam. I really appreciate you being here. And for everybody who's been here, thank you and wonderful questions. And I hope you have a wonderful night. I will send out the recording of the session in just a little bit. So watch it again.
Thank you, Mina. Thanks everybody for listening to me tell about Captain Kidd. I really appreciate it.
Good night, Sam.
Take care. Thanks.